so much going on in their lives, and they're curious and adventurous, but they're also at a place in their development where their brains are really malleable, which makes the impact that us as therapists or parents can have in their lives really magnified. The birth of this web series sort of came about because people were coming to us and asking us the same questions about parenting their teens. And I don't think that some new phenomenon happened with teens during COVID. Really, I think what happened was the lack of schedule and routine in the lives of teens sort of made some of those quirky things that make adolescents who they are come to the surface. So I'm here to answer a question that I think many of you may already know the answer to. Are teens nocturnal animals? Of course they are. But I'm going to talk to you about how you can sort of implement good strategies to help them get on the right track. So before I begin, I'm just going to ask a few questions for you to think about. How many of you think that you got good sleep as a teenager? And how many of you had a bedtime after like the age of 15 or 16? So studies show that a bedtime, even for a 17-year-old or 18-year-old, does result in more hours slept. However, I think as a society, we sort of decided that if a teen can drive and they can manage so many other aspects of their lives, it's inappropriate for us to have a bedtime for them. Now, our final question. How many of you had a cell phone or computer in your room growing up? So you probably know where I'm going with this, but I'll keep you in the dark a bit longer. So just a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. And Ned did mention it, but I'm going to go over it a bit more now. So the first thing I'm going to be talking about is teens and sleep. So there are normal adjustments that are made in terms of when a teen gets tired. And that's normal. That's based off of where they are in puberty. However, sleep is really important, and teens aren't getting enough sleep. And so I'm going to be discussing why sleep is so important. And then I'm going to be applying that to our contingency management approach. But before I do anything, I'd like to introduce our case study. So in graduate school, I remember that it was my favorite part of learning was applying the materials to a case study. So I'm going to introduce our case study and sort of pepper this example throughout to really make what I'm talking about have more life to it. So our case study today is a client of mine who I've worked with for a long time. He originally came to us because of a substance use issue, but he got sober pretty quickly and was doing well. And then COVID hit, and about 2 weeks after everyone had to come back and be in lockdown, his parents came to me and they said, "Julia, we're really concerned because our son has been sleeping all through the day and staying up all night. What should we do about it? We're concerned that maybe this is an indication that he's using again, or his mental health is not in a good place." So that's our case for the day, and I'm going to be talking more about it as we go. So the suggested number of sleep for teens is 9.25 hours. This is the average amount that's suggested by the CDC and the American Academy for Pediatrics. It sounds like a lot because it is, and really only 7% of teens get this much sleep. But far more concerning is that the majority of them are getting far less, and many are getting less than 6 hours. Sleep is non-negotiable, and if your pediatrician were to come to you and say that your teen was getting 30% less calories in a day, I imagine you'd be pretty concerned. And for this reason, the American Academy of Pediatrics stated in 2014 that sleep deprivation is an epidemic amongst teens. And I imagine that it's only gotten worse sort of as time has progressed and technology has become more part of people's lives. So like I said before, there is a normal shift in the way teens are getting tired. And right around puberty, what happens is their circadian rhythm, which is the rhythm which determines our sleep cycle, gets shifted forward 2 hours past that of an adult. Melatonin, which is the hormone that your body releases that sort of regulates when you get tired, is released 2 hours later for teens. So if you as a parent are getting tired at 10, chances are your teen isn't getting tired until about midnight. But then the melatonin stays in their system for a longer period of time. So when you wake up, you might be sort of groggy at first, but I imagine that anybody who's a parent of a teen knows that it can be impossible to wake their kids up. And this is because the melatonin is not only released later, but it stays in the system of a teen's body for longer and actually well into the day. And this, of course, impacts how tired they are throughout the day. So when I think about sort of biological shifts that occur that sort of seem to be dysfunctional, I like to look at the evolutionary basis of it. And the evolutionary basis of this is really quite interesting. So when we lived in tribes or in small clans, it was the adolescents who were the warriors. And so it was important that they were staying awake well into the evening so that they could stand guard and protect us. But it's also important that teens get a lot of sleep because of how their brain's developing. So the melatonin would stay in their system longer so that they were able to have that sleep. However, and this was the way that they were able to like function in society and protect us and keep us safe. But then there are also environmental and social forces going on in your teen's life. So not only are they not getting tired until later, but their desire to sleep is definitely compromised as well. Last week, we talked a bit about individuation and how it's very normal for your teen just to separate from their family unit and sort of want to explore. This is developmentally appropriate, and it means that your teen is growing up and maturing. It's a good and healthy thing. And when you're sleeping, what better time for them to sort of have this time to individuate and have this downtime. We also know that socializing happens in the evening. It's not just your teen that's staying up late talking to their friends. It's actually all their friends that are staying up late and talking to their friends. So it can be very appealing to stay up late and do that. Also, teens are busier than ever between school and extracurriculars. And so the amount of time that they have to sort of unwind and recharge has really been shrunken. And as a result, they're staying up late because of it. And then, of course, we have any potential undiagnosed anxiety, depression, or sleep disorders. So if a teen is worried, chances are it's harder for them to fall asleep. And we also know that sleep disorder is really the time that they are diagnosable is during adolescence. For example, narcolepsy and sleep phase delay, which are two of the more common ones. But I will say that while it certainly is possible that there is some undiagnosed sleep disorder or mental illness going on, more often than not, it's actually poor sleep hygiene that your teen has just fallen into a pattern of. And then, of course, we have the technology piece. And technology really is the worst nightmare of sleep because technology impacts the brain in a very similar way that drugs and alcohol and sex and all those things that we all already know are very addictive. It targets the same part of the brain. And so your teen can have a really hard time moderating that. I will say that just a little story about myself. So a little while back, I downloaded TikTok, the app, the like video app for teens, or for really anyone. But and it took like 5 hours spread out over 3 days for me to realize that this was not a good idea. And I am a therapist who works with adolescents, and my specialty is addiction. And it still took this long. And I'm not saying this to you to scare you or think that your teen is addicted to technology, but I am explaining it to you to show you really what they are up against. We also know that the way that blue light, which is the light that our devices give off, impacts the way that melatonin is produced. So the pineal gland, which is what secretes melatonin, is directly impacted by blue light. And so if your teen is already staying up late on their devices, the melatonin is getting released in their system even later. And this can make them tired later. Like literally the melatonin is happening later, and so they're getting tired later. And then we have this pretty well described phenomenon known as social jet lag. And social jet lag is something that happens when Your teen, as we all know, they're trying to catch up on their sleep during the weekend. And as a result, they're throwing off their whole sleep cycle for the entire week. There's a misconception that you have the ability to catch up on sleep, when in fact, the therapeutic value of sleep comes in being in a routine and sort of having that rhythm. So when a teen is going to bed much later on the weekend, they're just throwing off their sleep cycle. And as a result, they're not getting into that healthy rhythmic sleep. This was a really interesting study. It looked at how social media use, specifically Twitter, is used, and how we can actually track breaks in when teens are sleeping. And we can see that the breaks are much longer, so there's less tweets being tweeted by teens and adolescents and young adults during periods like winter break or the weekend, and also I imagine COVID, though of course we don't have the data to support that yet. So what is the big deal about all of this? Well, if you think back to when your teen was under the age of 5, I imagine that you really emphasize sleep. And if they didn't get those recommended hours of sleep, you would change your whole day around if they didn't get that second nap. Or maybe sometimes you wouldn't go out with friends or do something social because you were concerned that a babysitter wouldn't be able to help your teen or your child get enough sleep. So I'm now going to talk to you about the implications of not getting enough sleep in adolescence. And we know that they're pretty significant, just like they are in childhood. So sleep is critical for learning. And there's a process known as synaptic pruning, which is fundamental to brain growth and development. Essentially what happens is your brain is going through connections that exist and eliminating those that are insufficient or that are not necessary anymore. And this leaves room for more connections to be made. So if a teen is not sleeping, they're not having this ability to clean their brain, literally. And so investing in your teen's sleep now is investing in their brain tomorrow, but it's also investing in their brain well into the future. A lack of sleep directly impacts the prefrontal cortex. That's the decision-making part of the brain. That's the part of the brain that decides, I can't do B if I don't do A first. And that's something that's already sometimes more challenging for teens to do. But if they're not getting enough sleep, then their prefrontal cortex isn't having the ability to develop in the way that is most advantageous and most beneficial for a teen maturing into an adult. And finally, we have grades to show for it. So there are a lot of studies that look at how grades change when someone gets more sleep. And the reason for that is, as many of you may know, there's been a big push to delay school start times for this very reason. We know that teens are just on a different sleep schedule, yet forced to live by sort of our adult schedules. And a lot of studies look at how grades have changed, and all of them really bear out that grades improve. There was one of the more important or seminal studies looked at 3,000 high school students, and they found that there was a 4.3% increase in grades just by delaying start times by an hour. Sleep is critical for memory. The prefrontal cortex is what processes the information that we receive. And so if the prefrontal cortex is not rested or recharged in the evening, then it's not actually able to process that information. We also know that on the back end, sleep is really important. So when we sleep, it's like pushing the save button on an entire day's worth of information and learning. And if we're not sleeping, we're not doing that. So just as important as it is to have a brain that's like a sponge and able to absorb information, it's important also that you can sleep in the evening on the back end so that information is then kept in the brain. There are also so many physical consequences of poor sleep. And I'll just go through these quickly, but I think that we can all relate to waking up one day after a poor night's sleep and having a cold or not feeling so well. And this isn't because of new germs. This is because your immune system is compromised when you don't sleep. So now more than ever, it's really important that that we're getting enough sleep, so our immune system is in a good place to fight off any potential infections or diseases. And then also the digestive system. So when you sleep, your body produces, or your body reduces, a hormone that makes you full, and it produces a hormone that makes you hungry. And this is why some of us will like go to the fridge late into the evening. But if you're not sleeping, then your body is still giving off those hormones, and it's making you more hungry, but it's also throwing off your entire metabolism and digestive system. So the data is pretty clear that poor sleep leads directly to, or is very strongly correlated with childhood obesity and obesity throughout life. Cardiovascularly, our blood vessels restore and heal themselves while they're sleeping. And then finally, our endocrine system. The most dominant hormone for development is released while you're sleeping. So if your teen's not sleeping, they're not getting that hormone released in their body. Sleep also impacts emotional regulation. So the amygdala is sort of the emotional control center of our brain. And the amygdala is 60% more active in a sleep-deprived sample as compared to a well-slept or sleep control sample. So that amygdala is like a fire alarm, and that fire alarm is 60% more sensitive to emotion and threat. This is why teens who are already sort of sometimes emotionally dysregulated become much more dysregulated when they're not sleeping. And then when I was talking before about the prefrontal cortex and how that's impacted. Well, the prefrontal cortex is that logic center. So that's how your body identifies the validity of a threat. There was a really interesting study that looked at how worry changes based off of sleep. And they found that it's not the amount of worry that changes. However, the likelihood that the individual will rate that worry as viable and legitimate, and also how much they'll catastrophize or perceive that to be a very scary threat. Then we have sleep and its impact on risk-taking. Teens are already more likely to engage in risk-taking, but insufficient sleep impacts reward-related decision-making in the caudate nucleus. And for this reason, we know that a teen who gets 6 hours or less of sleep is actually 2 times more likely to engage in risky behaviors like drug or alcohol use than their peers who sleep for 8 hours in the evening. So what can you do? These are some very sort of straightforward and concrete examples of what you can try, and then I'll teach you a bit more about contingency management and how you can apply it. But one thing is and probably the place to start is to eliminate technology. So technology is like a beacon for kids to explore, and it can be hard for any of us to regulate our technology use, but especially a teen. Sleep conditions are really important. So if your room isn't dark enough or it's too warm, it's really hard for anybody to fall asleep. And if your teen is getting tired later and already might have a lack of interest in going to sleep, then it's going to throw that off even farther. I always say to parents that it's important to model the behaviors that they want their teen to engage in. So if you want your teen to sleep, you should probably prioritize it in your life as well. And then of course we have the impact of caffeine, nicotine use, or snacking before bed. That's just gonna cue the brain that it's not time to sleep, which is gonna throw things off. And then finally, daily activity. Daily activity is really important. It's hard these days to get out of our houses and do things. But if you're outside in the sun, we know that it has a positive influence on the way that your body releases melatonin, and therefore it can help make a more rhythmic sleep cycle in your teen. But with all this information, how do you help incorporate it in your teen's life? So we've talked a bit about contingency management, and contingency management is really a way to help your teen incorporate more desirable behaviors in their day-to-day. Reinforcing or responding to behavior in a way that makes that behavior more desirable also makes it more likely to occur. So if you identify ways that you can help your teen restructure what's already motivating them, it can really help them just restructure their lives to prioritize things that they might not already be prioritizing. For example, if your teen is staying up late talking to a friend, right now that might be more desirable or more motivating for them than waking up and starting their day on time. But if you can help them to readjust that and put their ability to interact with their friends as contingent on them getting a good night's sleep, then you can help them restructure their motivating system. So how do you do this? So I'm going to talk about this generally, and then I'm going to bring our case example back in. So you're going to want to identify 1 or 2 behaviors that you want to see. No one's really looking to micromanage anyone. And if you really stick to 1 or 2 behaviors, you can emphasize their importance and really focus your energy on them. But the next really important piece is to figure out how you want to measure these behaviors. This is really important. And last week, Ned talked about how being respectful and contingency management don't always go so well together. And this is because being respectful isn't a measurable behavior. And by that, I mean that someone might observe it and define it differently than someone else. So by choosing actionable and visual or like audio behaviors, you're actually able to eliminate any potential power struggles that could happen. The other part about identifying a behavior that's measurable is we know that behavioral change is more likely to occur and more likely to be effective when the behaviors are measurable. So for example, if you decided one day you wanted to start an exercise routine, would it be most effective if you said, I'd like to start exercising tomorrow? Or would it be most effective if you said, I'd like to exercise 4 times this week? I imagine that if you said the latter, you would be more likely to be effective with this. And that's because when we set measurable goals for ourselves, they're actually more goal-oriented and less sort of based off of how you feel or the individual or your decision about whether or not you've made that goal. And then you're going to want to identify a motivating contingency. So a motivating contingency will be something that's already motivating your teen, but could be getting in the way of them doing something that you think would be healthy or good for them. When we talked last week about how something associated with like their freedom, so for example, driving a car or having access to their technology. These are also the things that left completely to their discretion, and we'll talk more about this next week, but left completely to their discretion can get in the way and become problematic when they're preventing them from doing other healthier behaviors like going to sleep on time. So when you identify a motivating contingency, the second piece of this is that it in no way eliminates their right to choose. So a teen can make a decision one evening that they'd rather stay up late on their phone, as long as they're willing to accept the sort of results or consequences of it the next day. And you have to be able to put that on an even playing field as if they do decide to go to sleep one night, because it's all about restructuring what's motivating them, but still giving them the opportunity to decide on a day-to-day basis what would be most motivating for them. And then finally, you're going to want to stick to it as much as possible. This can be really hard, and I'll just be honest about that. It can be hard because teens, like adults, like children, they don't necessarily want consequences for their actions. That's a very normal thing. We don't want to feel consequences for the things that we do. So they'll probably try to find a way to get out of the consequences, even if they don't stick with the contingency. So a story that I really like to use as an example of this, and one of my favorite stories is, I was working with a family and they told me about their curfew that they had for their daughter. And one night she came 5 minutes late for curfew. And so they were waiting for her because the contingency for being late for curfew was that she would not be able to drive the car the next day. And so they were waiting for her, and they asked her for the car keys. And is to be expected, she got very upset. She said it was unfair. She said none of her friends had the same curfew, and she got emotional, and she really did what she could to try to get out of the contingency. And then the last thing that she did was she told them that the reason why she was late was because she was driving a friend home who had been drinking that evening. Her parents relayed this to me after the fact, and they really stressed how hard it was for them to stick to their contingency plan when it felt like they were punishing her from doing a behavior that they thought was safe and mature and appropriate. But they did do it, and I was so proud of them for doing it because I know how hard it was. And the reason why they were able to be effective with this was because they did treat it as two different behaviors. So they praised her for having done the safe, mature, and responsible thing. And they also stuck to the contingency. She, of course, wasn't happy about it, but I think the proof is in the pudding in this one. And as far as I know, she really was never late for curfew again. So now I'm going to use our case example. Just to give you a bit more background. So like I said, they came to me concerned about how their son was sleeping. And when in discussion with their son, he had actually said to me, and this goes to what we were talking about before about individuating, that the reason why he stayed awake at night was because it was a way that he could like feel like he had space away from his parents. They were all living under the same roof, as many of us were and are now. And he just needed that space to breathe. So his parents identified one or two behaviors that they wanted to see. And what they had decided was that they wanted him to wake up each day by 9 a.m. And their rationale for this was that if he had to wake up during the week at 9 a.m., then he would be more tired in the evening and more likely to go to sleep at a reasonable hour the next evening if he didn't go to bed at a good hour the night before. And then the second thing that they wanted to see was they really wanted him to be out of his room between 9 and 5 each day. And their reasoning behind this was that if he wasn't able to get into like a good, healthy work schedule, then maybe it was something about his mental health that was going on. So they decided that their measurable behaviors would just be that he was out of his room from 9 to 5. Pretty straightforward, also observable. And there was a lot of discussion around what he would be doing between 9 and 5. And we talked about it a lot, but ultimately in the spirit of one or two behaviors, they really just had to pick those two behaviors of getting up by 9 and being out of his room. And so what he did during the day between 9 to 5 wasn't really up for discussion. And then the motivating contingency that they put with it was that he would lose his car privileges on the weekend. So that was an immediate contingency, but there was a more long-term contingency because there was concerns about his mental health. And in hindsight, this was less measurable, but what they had said was if he wasn't able to get on to a good sleep routine and like a good day-to-day routine, they would have to rethink if he was in a good mental and physical condition to return to school in the fall. This was super motivating to him. It was really important for him to get back to school. And so ultimately they didn't really have to enforce this as they went, which leads to my next point. And a point that's really all part of contingency management is our ability to work smarter, but not necessarily harder. So a good contingency plan has the framework built in and often requires you to do a lot of work at the front end, but will really like perpetuate itself as you go. Power struggles might come up, but ultimately, if you just establish clear, observable behaviors, they should really be minimalized throughout the process. So to give you another case example, I was working with a young girl, and her parents were concerned that she wasn't doing very well or functioning very well during the day. And they went to a lot of doctors. They were concerned that maybe it was something going on with her health. So they had blood tests conducted and they saw doctors, and really all the results were inconclusive. So they came to me and we talked about it. And one of the first questions I ask around functioning, because I know how important sleep is how are they sleeping at night? And her parents said to me, well, we're really not sure. She goes to her room around 9 or 10. And so we figure she's asleep. And then I asked them about her access to technology and if she has her phone at night. And she did. And so we talked about this and sort of the science behind it and how it probably is getting in the way of her getting a good night's sleep. And we all came together and essentially decided that we needed to find a plan that helped her separate from her technology at night. She was upset about this, as to be expected, and I later learned that a lot of her frustration or emotionalness about it was the fact that she was kind of anxious that she wasn't able to sleep, and she was concerned that if she wasn't able to sleep, then she wouldn't have a way to entertain herself. So we decided that we would try it for 2 weeks and see how it went. And we decided that she would give her phone to her parents at 11 p.m. and then we would just reassess it as it went. Sure enough, this worked really well, and she got into a good sleep cycle. But as more time passed, her parents came to me and they said to me that, the plan's still working, but sometimes she doesn't give us her phone and we're not really sure what to do because we think she's sleeping well again, but we're not sure. And she had said to them, I'm on a good sleep cycle. Why do you need to take my phone away? So we all came together again. And essentially what we decided was, in the spirit of working smarter but not harder, we would install a parental control on her phone, which would help regulate, which would turn off at 11 p.m. each evening. And this was a way to just eliminate any power struggle that was going on. Her phone, it made the informal world more informal, and she was able to just sort of accept that her phone turned off. There was no negotiating as they went. So, and we'll definitely talk more about this next week, but parental control apps are really great to help moderate and help manage your teen's screen use. And especially if they're getting in the way of your teen sleeping, it could be a good route to go. The first two, custodial and screen time, are probably the two that we use the most. Custodial is great for Android and Microsoft devices, and it's great because it creates like a plan for all devices, and you can make it vary based off of the device, but for the most part, it's pretty standardized. Screen time, it's already built into the iPhone. So if you think that this might be a route that would be beneficial for you to go, then I would just recommend sort of exploring the capabilities on screen time. And of course, I'm happy to talk with anybody more about how to get a parental control app doing what it does best and functioning in a way that you want. And then these are two other ones. We use them less often. Something kind of cool about our Pact is it allows you to split up the amount of time that they're on their phone. So not only do you set like a time limit, but you can also split it up into like 30-minute increments. And this helps them to learn how to like moderate their use throughout the day. And then finally, Net Nanny. It's a bit more expensive, but it's pretty comprehensive. Parental control apps and really adding technology into you or your teen's life might seem overwhelming, and I totally get that. But I will say that in my experience, it really does pay dividends throughout time. So essentially, these are the key takeaways that I think are important for you to sort of know about sleep, and also about how to use contingency management with sleep. So most teens are not getting enough sleep, and this is a normal shift that occurs, and it's a function of a biological shift, but also some changes in their social and environmental pressures that are occurring and might be more appealing during adolescence. But if your teen is not getting enough sleep, chances are that their nighttime use of technology is at least in part to blame. And so a lot of benefits can come from creating a contingency plan that helps them restructure what is getting in the way of their sleep. And it might be that what's getting in their way of their sleep is also what's motivating for them. And chances are it probably is. But as a parent, you can really use this as a tool to help your teen live a healthy lifestyle. So I really do want to thank everyone for being so attentive and coming to our webinar. I know that it's a hard time for teens right now. It's also a hard time for parents, and I appreciate the way you're supporting your teen. I'd love to take questions that anyone may have. This is also my contact information. I know it can be sort of intimidating or hard to ask questions in a forum like this. And so if you have any questions about either your teen or just more general questions, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to help in any way that I can. So I am going to stop sharing, and I would love to take some questions. Okay, so the first question is, do blue light glasses help? Yes, they do help. However, they help in terms of the secretion of melatonin, so your body's release of melatonin, because they shelter your eyes from that. But when we know that technology is addictive in and of itself, it's the impact of, you know, changing the way that the body releases melatonin. If the body's not tired, or if the body's tired but still doesn't want to sleep because there's something more appealing for them, then it can be it can really fall short. So it is a step, and potentially during the day it can be a really effective thing to do, but it might not pay the same, it might not benefit them in the same way that just having it stop time for technology would. A lot of information I know and I've tried to relay to my teen, but it doesn't register. Is there a presentation like this that is geared towards teens? So that's a really good point and a great question. I mean, I think that if a teen, it's really important for anybody to have more information, and it can really make a big difference. I'd be happy to do a presentation for teens, or even talk to your teen about this science. And yeah, so you know how to contact me, and but I can also I can also produce something that might be more digestible for a teen. I see that there is more interest in that. I found teens are interested in brain info. I used to work with teens in substance use treatment, helping them find what they value, but they do need adults involved to remind them and create an environment conducive to healthy routines. They don't just have the brain development to follow through. Heather, I completely agree with you on that. Often teens do know what is good for them and know what's healthy for them, but it can be really hard for them to incorporate that into their lives. And that is sort of why parents can really have a big impact, especially if they create that structure to help reinforce what they might already know to be true. Is it more effective to set a bedtime or wake time? That is also a good question. I think either is helpful. But the thing about setting a wake time is it's usually more enforceable. So you can't really determine when your teen's body falls asleep, but you can determine when they wake up, and you can, in the spirit of making sure it's measurable, you can really track that. So I would say that probably setting a wake time is the best way to go, especially because it will make their circadian rhythm more rhythmic throughout the day, and it will probably motivate them to want to go to sleep earlier. What is your stance on the use of melatonin pills? Great question, a question that I get a lot. And I would say that melatonin pills can be helpful. However, because sleep is like a basic human function, and it's really important to day-to-day functioning, adding a medication to assist with that would probably be a last resort. And so my recommendation would be to help to sort of implement some of these more sleep hygiene oriented tries, and see if that or hygiene-oriented suggestions and see if that helps. And if not, before you do start them on a regular medication routine, I definitely would suggest consulting a doctor about it, just because you don't want to introduce a substance, even if it's naturally occurring, without seeking the supervision or guidance of their pediatrician or a doctor. What about the amount of work some teens have because of school that has to be done, but there's not enough time in the day to get it done? Also a really good question. I will say, and it can, there might be different schools of thought around this, but for the most part, if your teen isn't getting enough sleep, they're not functioning in the same way during the day, and they're not getting as much out of their schoolwork to begin with. So while schoolwork is important, if it really is a situation where they're not able to get their work done, I would recommend you consulting with their school or other, or looking at what extracurriculars they're involved in, because sleep is really, really important. And so it's important to also be able to help them build a life where they can prioritize that. And if schoolwork's getting in the way, then that is something that maybe does need to be adjusted, or their other commitments need to be adjusted. Can you remind us how to contact you? So I will put my PowerPoint online, and also I'll say it now, my email is jkatzman, KATZMAN, @planyourrecovery.com. Thank you, Ned. And my phone number is 314-527-0557. Can we access this presentation after it's over? I hit record, but then I said I needed permission. Yes, you can definitely access it. We're going to post it online, and yeah, feel free to continue to watch it or share it. Anyone else have any questions or feedback, comments?
So yeah, we'll send it out to all of the people who registered. So all of you registered if you're on this, or you got your registration, the link perhaps from someone else, but I think most of you registered. So we'll do another email blast with an update this week that has the video and an announcement for the next webinar. I just want to just emphasize something that was discussed earlier on when someone said, I've given my teen all this information and it just doesn't work. It's not enough. Or like, how can we present the information in a way that they'll understand? I think one of the biggest challenges or missteps we can make as parents of teens is that they become so articulate. Their minds are working so fast. They're so much smarter than us, even in some ways. They're learning things that we didn't even learn when we were in high school. And we're like, well, they're great. They're well situated now to just look at the science of things and make good decisions. But developmentally, they're not there yet. And so it can be, if we start treating them like adults when they are really still very much kids in adult bodies, kids with an adult vocabulary, then we really become disappointed. I've told them over and over again how sleep is important. I've had them read books. I've showed them lectures. I've showed them Julia's presentation that she designed, and they're still just not doing it. The fact is that teens need more scaffolding than that to deal especially with things that are addictive like technology. There's a documentary that you can't really watch unless you order it for your school or for your practice, and that's just the way they distribute it. It's not online anywhere, but it's called Screenagers. And there's this one scene in Screenagers where the interviewer finds the teens on campus and says, and these are the same teens that are in power struggles over their technology and the limits their parents are giving them. And they say, so do you guys think it's a good idea that your parents, no parents are around, that your parents put limits on your technology? And every single one of the groups says, oh, definitely. We would be a mess if we didn't have limits on our technology. But in conversation with their parents, they're like, oh, no, you shouldn't put a limit on my technology. That's my private stuff. And it's a completely different situation. Teens will advocate for their freedom even when in another conversation, they can say that their freedom is not, they can't use it that well. And so they're just not at a developmental stage where persuasion or information is enough. Any other questions for Julia?
I did have a question. I know this is designed for parents, but I've recently started working with parents and teens, so I'm kind of like trying to learn more about regular kind of teen development. Um, I work with some parents who can't supervise their children like during the day now. And so it's became very hard to more like regulate their sleep schedule and like what time they wake up. And I don't know if you have any advice for when there's no supervision there to kind of help a teen wake up on time for like their virtual classes.
So that's a great question. And the world today is, of course, more complicated than it was 7 months ago. And so we really do, as parents, as educators, as therapists, need to be creative right now. I would say that one just sort of off the cuff thing is, if your teen doesn't have access to their phone, also, how are they going to set an alarm? We'll start buying like remote alarm clocks, incorporate that into their daily routine. And then also things you can do to sort of make sure that they show up on time for school. I mean, if there's a way to work with like teachers to track attendance, I mean, then you have a measurable behavior. So like I said before, it's about making sure that you can like have a measurement. And if you have a measurable behavior, which might mean that you need to consult like a neighbor or also a teacher to sort of track this, then you can set a contingency with it and make it motivating for them. But I hear you that it's a different world right now, and our usual strategies maybe are falling short or not sufficient in a COVID world.
Can I weigh in really quickly on that one?
Absolutely.
Sometimes when you're in this real bind where obviously the parents have less control, the first source of information is really the teen. You can come to them with your dilemma and say, your parents aren't around, but we really need to help you get up. You know, what would be motivating to you? I mean, I do this with my kids. What would get you to practice your violin? They'll name it, and then I'm like, great, done, deal sold. You know, let's shake here, right? And then they practice it, and then they get their thing. If you go to the teen and say, what can we do? Like, what rewards can your parents give you if you're like on time every day, if you're up every day for this week? Work with the parents on, securing that reward. Make sure, like Julia says, that the thing is measurable, and then reward. It doesn't always have to be consequent, like negative. It shouldn't always be negative consequences. You can just implement positive rewards. And what you also do is show the teen how much the parents value that behavior, that they're willing to give maybe even a significant reward for showing compliance. And so, I mean, the teens are great sources of motivation for their own behavior. And if you really have to work separately from the parents to develop a contingency where they're going to be in more control, we have to involve them even more.
Yeah. So there's another question. What if the rewards they request are more tech or technology oriented? By all means, like if that's what's motivating for them, then you should absolutely use it. There's nothing wrong with technology when it comes to, I mean, there are problems with technology, but there's nothing inherently wrong with technology. Where it becomes problematic is if it's getting in the way of them doing other things. So if you can actually use that technology to motivate them to wake up for school in the morning and go through their morning routine on their own, then that's a great motivating resource to use. It really doesn't matter if it's technology or something else.
Kristen Craren suggests, she says she drops in on her kid via Alexa. So I guess there are ways to try to be present, but that can be challenging as well. Obviously, our goal is to get teens to have this like ownership or like this self-efficacy to do these things on their own, and well-designed contingencies sort of move them in that direction over time.
Yeah, and to have ownership before we make any change is really hard. Not to use the exercise routine, for example. It's really hard to stick with an exercise routine at the beginning because it's not as motivating. But when you get into the pattern and you start to feel the rewards of exercising or the rewards of getting a good night's sleep at night, it becomes intrinsically motivating. And so like Heather was saying, teens have all the pieces, but it's our job as parents or educators or therapists to help scaffold what they already have, which is things motivating them, a good understanding of what they need to do and how to do it, and then we can help sort of support them and make that like actionable and measurable and rewarding.
All right, we have time for maybe one more question. And if not, do you want to thank everybody for coming and tell them what's up next week?
So next week we have our webinar on like problematic screen use, problematic substance use, and then we'll be diving in more about how to use contingency management with this. This is really what the birth of contingency management came from, was addressing more problematic substance use in people who came to treatment not necessarily motivated to separate themselves with substances. So we'll be talking about contingency management, how to apply that. And again, thank you for coming, and really excited about all this, and great to see everyone have such an interest in how to support teens right now.
Great, thank you all so much. We'll see you next week, and we'll send out an announcement later this week.